Thank you. This is me. Summer 2006, 25 years old, a bright young foreign correspondent about to break my neck. I've been a working adult for 2 decades, most of it as a journalist for Reuters news agency. I've covered conflicts, crises, a hemorrhagic fever outbreak, and more elections than I can count. It's cost me the use of most of my limbs, and it has been one hell of a ride. But enough of me, at least for now, because I feel that over that same time period, the world has been on a very similar roller coaster. I want to look at what that's been driving that, what it means, and where we go from here. Let's start with the late 20th century, the world that I grew up in. The Berlin Wall came down when I was 8. It's about the first major news story I remember. History, we were told, was sort of over. Everyone was agreed on democracy, capitalism, and the endless spread of shopping malls. It was still a very analog world. When I was at school, if you wanted to find something out that wasn't in a newspaper, you had to go to a library and a book, where everything was often already 10 years out of date. By the time I came here to London at the turn of the millennium, all of that was on the cusp of change. The first jobs I got were writing for the early dot-coms, generating content for a revolution we all thought would make the world a better place. Now, it doesn't seem so simple. The world today feels more contested, more in flux than at any point since 1945. 3 quick examples. With the return of tensions between Russia, China, and the West, global war is no longer as unthinkable as it was. Ideas are also back in fashion, most alarmingly with the rise of the far right in Europe. So too is dictatorship and repression. These are internment camps in northwest China, home against their will to more than 1 million of Chinese ethnic Muslim Uyghur minority. It's the largest mass incarceration of a religious or ethnic group since the Holocaust, and with so much else going on, it barely makes the headlines. So what went wrong, and where do we go from here? When I was 20, we had 9/11. It felt totemic, but with hindsight, I feel like we drew many of the wrong conclusions. The greatest threats to our way of life, we decided, came from dusty, dangerous places far away. And so we sent people out there to fix them, and as we discovered in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were not always very good at it. These somewhat patronizing assumptions were very widespread. One of the reasons I think I felt so compelled to go overseas was the feeling you had to go a long way to find where interesting stuff was still happening. But as a foreign correspondent, first in Southern Africa, what I found wasn't always what I expected. In farmers' fields, mines, minibus taxi stands, people were increasingly talking about China, the rise of emerging economies. In the West, we often hadn't noticed. Tony Blair's 2005 Gleneagles Summit, aimed at saving Africa, felt particularly patronizing if you were actually there. In the West, things were also changing fast. Globalization brought winners, but also losers. Jobs vanished or became insecure. Migration changed communities. And we also saw a dark new globalization. When war returned to Sri Lanka, the West told both sides to stop. They didn't. The government had new friends in Beijing, and they didn't care how many people got killed on the path to real stability. Russia was getting its confidence back, helped by rising oil prices and with Vladimir Putin now firmly in control. In 2007, they launched the first major international cyber attack against Estonia. They won a war with Georgia the following year. To an extent, we in the West only had ourselves to blame. With Guantanamo, Iraq, extraordinary rendition, we'd torn up parts of the international rulebook because we thought it would make us safer. Now others were doing the same. I, meanwhile, was about to get a literal crash course in the strengths and weaknesses of what we'd built in the West. On September 5, 2006, I was on a reporting trip in eastern Sri Lanka when my minibus hit a tractor. I went crashing into the windscreen, broke my third, fourth, and fifth vertebrae, and awoke completely paralyzed. For a few moments, I lay there in the wreckage, pondering my options. I knew I was very lucky. I was a British national. There was a welfare state to look after me. All options that my local Sri Lankan colleagues or the villagers who lifted me from the vehicle simply would not have had. And so I came home. Hospital, rehab, learning to use voice recognition software, drive a wheelchair with my head. 9 months after the injury, I got back to work for Reuters in Canary Wharf. Skyscrapers everywhere, height of the banking boom. And then, of course, the wheels came off again. 2008 financial crisis showed us all that those in power had never really been in control. Banks went bust, so did a couple of countries. I was already feeling guilty enough about the resources I consumed. Suddenly, I started to feel like a luxury my country was no longer sure it wanted to afford. Globally, things next came to a head with the 2011 Arab Spring. It was the product of economic hardship, political frustration, coming head-to-head with autocratic governments desperate to retain control. Powered, of course, by the information revolution and the rise of social media. It wasn't just the Middle East. Globalization had driven up the wealth gap almost everywhere. In the West, we had Occupy, and other forces were waiting in the wings. I, meanwhile, was about to get lucky, and I'm not just talking about my sex life. That same year, 2011, I got a major financial settlement from my employer. For the first time, I had the money to pay for my own care, to live where and how I chose. The world, meanwhile, just kept on getting messier. Syria, Ukraine, Trump, Brexit, not a lot feeling positive. I have a confession to make. That kind of messy, volatile world is exactly where I thrive, at least where I'm able to. This is a picture of me putting the final touches to this talk in the back of my vehicle 2 weeks ago, somewhere near Salisbury Plain. The year after Russia annexed Crimea, the British Army asked me to return to its reserve to provide training and development in new areas like information warfare. I am, I think, the planet's most disabled serving soldier, at least on a part-time basis. I'm hugely lucky to be able to do it. It nearly didn't happen. If I hadn't got that financial settlement, my social worker told me in 2015, same year the Army asked me back, that my council no longer had the money to look after me. I would have been put away in a nursing home, just as I was getting started. Now, don't get me wrong, we have a lot to feel proud of. In almost every country in the world, it's still the best time to be alive if you are a woman, a person of color, lesbian, gay, transgendered, almost any previously marginalized group or minority. But such social advances can't be taken for granted, because in some areas we're already going backwards. When I came to London in 1999, we'd all but eradicated street homelessness. Now, once again, it's a highly visible problem. In the UK, life expectancy is falling. In the US, a woman is now more likely to die in childbirth than she was a generation earlier. It's hardly a surprise that people are losing hope, and there's no shortage of forces, both at home and abroad, ready to take advantage of that. Technology, too, is proving a very double-edged sword. It's doing amazing, wonderful things. Some of the best reporting today is done through open sources. Citizen journalists in their bedroom uncovering bad things half a world away. It's how we know so much about what's going on in Syria, China, Yemen, and elsewhere. But tech is also empowering those in authority. In China in particular, we see artificial intelligence and mass surveillance coming together to produce a police state on a scale we've never really seen. It's bringing the world to a turning point, and it's up to us where it really goes. A lot comes down to values-driven leadership. This is Lenin Moreno. As Vice President of Ecuador, he massively ramped up the level of funding and services given to the country's disabled community. Last year, he became their president. He's the only world leader with a very visible disability. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. With the Christchurch Mosque massacre earlier this year, we saw a great example from her on what inclusive but decisive leadership really looks like. Also doing really impressive things on economic policy, looking beyond overly simplistic economic growth at broader national well-being. Finally, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and the beginnings of a Green New Deal. Named, of course, for the original New Deal in the 1930s that helped get America out of the Great Depression. That was the brainchild of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was in a wheelchair, privileged, hugely wealthy guy, but he also had the willpower to keep going after people wrote him off after his diagnosis with polio. We are incredibly lucky that he did so, because without that New Deal, infrastructure investment, re-establishing the social contract, it's doubtful the United States would have had the resilience to face down Hitler and Imperial Japan. Put simply, we would not be here today. We have a lot to do. Globalization in its broadest sense cannot be the enemy any more than technology. We live on one interconnected world, and we need to make that work. Perhaps even more important than that, though, I think that democracies need to make sure that they keep protecting and empowering the most vulnerable and the previously marginalized. Because if they aren't, I really don't think they are going to survive. For my part, for the last 3 years, I've been campaigning for the British Labour Party. This is me in Aldershot during the local elections last month, trying to persuade this 93-year-old Second World War Burma veteran to vote Labour for the first time since 1945. My politics won't be everyone's, and the Labour Party isn't perfect. But I have found it hugely empowering, after all I've been through, to have the chance to fight and campaign for what I believe in, particularly the welfare state that saved my life. I don't know what the future holds for me, although I know there's a number of things I want to do. But I do know this: history is not over, and if we're going to make it through in one piece, we're going to need everyone to play their part. Thank you.